to a significant degree, I think Putin's backed himself into a massive corner with this entire war. He's trapped in Ukraine. There's no obvious route to victory for Putin at the moment, but it's also very difficult to see how he could get out of this war and maintain any sort of maintain his own regime or his own legitimacy at home in Russia. So he's in a very tight spot, and I don't think he knows what to do.
I'm joined today by editor of the UkraineAlert blog at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Centre, Peter Dickinson. Thank you for taking the time today.
Pleasure to join you. Thanks for having me.
We saw Trump and Putin speaking yesterday ahead of the meeting between Zelensky and Trump today. We'll get on to today's events a little bit later, but I wanted to ask you about how the context of today's meeting has changed in light of yesterday's phone call and the meeting between Trump and Putin. And in particular, I want to know what you think the significance was of the timing of Putin's call with Trump yesterday. Do you think Putin was maybe panicking and wanted to get in there first?
Yeah, absolutely. Putin is sometimes described as a sort of 5D chess player, but actually he's a bit of a bluffer, really. And whenever he's in a tight spot, and whenever he thinks he's losing his advantages in some area, and particularly in terms of with the Americans, he tends to come up with some new proposals for talks or meetings, and to try and regain the initiative. And we saw this at the very start of Trump's presidency when he proposed talks in Saudi Arabia, when Trump was sort of coming out quite robustly initially, and he said, let's have talks. And they had these talks. They went nowhere. Then when the European leaders came to Kiev in May and basically gave Putin an ultimatum saying we're going to impose sanctions, and we're going to arm Ukraine more and basically make life much more difficult for Russia, Putin came out and said, hold on, let's have bilateral talks between Ukraine and Russia in Istanbul. Then, of course, we had Trump again escalating his rhetoric in August, and that led to Putin saying, okay, let's have a meeting in Alaska. And now we have the Tomahawks discussion, and Putin, Trump generally getting more and more pro-Ukraine in his rhetoric, and lo and behold, again we have a proposal for a new summit in Budapest. So, this is really essentially it's stalling tactics. Again, he's trying to buy time, and we see this again and again and again. Now, one would assume that the Americans also see it, but certainly there's a clear pattern.
So, would you say that Trump is being played again by Putin? And if so, do you think he's a little bit more aware of it this time?
I mean, certainly he's being played by Putin. You'd have to assume that he is. I mean, for whatever else Trump may be, and he's certainly an unorthodox politician, but he's not a fool. He must be aware of what Putin's game is here, because it's blatantly obvious. It's clear as day. So maybe he thinks that over time he can somehow win Putin over or pressure him or sort of gain some sort of advantage. But clearly, Putin's game is to drag this out, is to distract Trump and to sort of defer any negative consequences, weapons for Ukraine or sanctions for Russia, usually. And he's going to continue playing this game as long as he's allowed to. So, at some point, we keep talking about how much patience Trump has, when it's going to run out. Is it running out? We think it might be running out. Everyone speculate on this. That must be the case. I mean, again, he's not a child. But he keeps going ahead with these summits, and you've got to wonder what the goal is going to be for this summit. What can they expect to come out of it? Because nothing came out of Alaska.
And before we move on to the summit between Putin and Trump, do you think Putin was successful in preventing Trump from giving Ukraine Tomahawks through this phone call, or do you think Trump's plan all along was to threaten with Tomahawks to bring Putin to the table?
That's a good question. I mean, we don't know, of course. I certainly don't know. I don't think anybody knows. It could have been a ploy. It certainly could have been a bluff on Trump's part to try and, create the impression that if he doesn't, if Putin doesn't play along, if he doesn't finally come to the negotiating table, there will be consequences, and Tomahawks would be a fairly significant consequence. And so that's certainly potentially a factor. I think now with the Trump-Putin summit looming now in Budapest, we're not going to see any major moves from Trump before that. One would assume that he wouldn't want to disrupt the potential for negotiations, however narrow that potential may be. So, we don't know whether Trump was on the verge of sending Tomahawks or how many he was prepared to send, but I think now certainly that's going to be on pause while they prepare for this summit, and Trump will look to sort of try and incentivize Putin to make some sort of concessions and show some willing that he's ready to end the war.
So if we do skip ahead to the meeting between senior figures of Russia and America goes well, and Trump and Putin do meet again in Budapest, which I'll ask you about the significance of that in a moment. But assuming we get to that meeting, what do you think would follow that meeting? Because like you said, with Alaska, nothing came out of it. But there was reports, I think, in CNN saying that America had increased intelligence sharing with Ukraine, which is potentially why we've been seeing sort of an oil refinery blowing up every week or few days. What do you see coming out of a damp squib of a meeting in Budapest this time?
Well, no, yeah, I mean, it does seem, based on recent reports, that the Americans did actually come. Now, the Alaska summit did actually have results, but not the results that Russia was looking for. It seems that America came out of that. Trump came out of that personally. With a very frustrated and with an impression that Putin was not, despite what he said publicly, he was quite clear. I think it seems that Putin was not in any way ready to compromise. So it would appear that America has been increasing its intelligence sharing with Ukraine, has been supporting Ukraine's long-range strike campaign inside Russia. So we've got a lot of refineries have been hit in the last 2 months. And also other logistics hubs, other aspects of the energy industry, and also the sort of military industrial complex. So, Ukraine's carrying out a very extensive campaign, and it seems the Americans are supporting that. So, the Tomahawks, of course, would be a very interesting addition to that, but they're already supporting it, and that seems to have come largely from Trump's frustration over what happened in Alaska, or what didn't happen. And so, you would assume that if they meet in Budapest, I still think that the room for any serious progress toward peace is extremely narrow, almost non-existent. Putin's quite clear that he still intends to maintain these sort of maximalist goals. He wants to extinguish Ukrainian statehood, essentially, or establish a puppet regime. He cannot allow Ukraine to emerge from this war as an independent sovereign state. So there's not a lot of middle ground here. So assuming that's the case, they go into Budapest, they come out of it with not a lot to show for it. I think it's reasonable, I think, to assume that we're going to see some form of increase in American backing. It's not necessarily going to be something that we're going to see publicly in terms of the delivery of weapons, but Trump has already moved on that with the intelligence sharing. Presumably, that will, he would continue along that path.
So then, do you think Putin could have almost backed himself into a bit of a corner here, because it's unlikely he will change his maximalist demands, but then if he doesn't, Trump will obviously respond, like you say, as he did before with Alaska?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, to a significant degree, I think Putin's backed himself into a massive corner with this entire war. He's trapped in Ukraine. There's no obvious route to victory for Putin at the moment, but it's also very difficult to see how he could get out of this war and maintain any sort of maintain his own regime or his own legitimacy at home in Russia. So he's in a very tight spot, and I don't think he knows what to do. And he's simply just saying, okay, well, I'm just going to keep going. I'm just going to kick the can down the road and hope that something turns up, hope that Ukraine collapses, or there's changes of government in Europe which makes European support evaporate, or something else along those lines. I mean, I think there's no grand strategy here from Putin's position. I think he's simply saying, okay, what I've got to do is I've got to make sure that Trump doesn't increase the pressure on us. He doesn't increase sanctions pressure. He doesn't increase weapons for Ukraine. He's certainly going to try and divide Europe and America, but fundamentally he's just playing for time. And I think that's his strategy. That's the extent of it. I don't think it goes much beyond that, because I don't think he really knows what to do. He's just hoping that something will present itself and he can somehow get out of this terrible, terrible mess that he's found himself in.
I suppose the question is then, what could Putin give to Trump, either symbolic or practical or whatever you'd call it, that would keep the situation stalled, that would prevent further American support for Ukraine?
Well, I mean, what we've seen in terms of other sort of diplomatic charades that the Russians have put on in the last half year or so, we've seen, the things that they can deliver. One thing they deliver is prisoner exchanges. So we've seen every time the Russians and Ukrainians meet in Istanbul, nothing is agreed. The Russians put out all sorts of outrageous demands, and all it does is really enforce how the complete absence of any room for negotiation, essentially. But they always come out with some humanitarian issue, so they have prisoner exchanges. So maybe something along those lines. Maybe there'll be some sort of thought, but it's limited because the Russian position is so maximalist, and their goals in Ukraine cannot be reached by some sort of a compromise. Again, Ukraine as a country, the whole drive here from Putin, his entire the entire reason behind the war is to stop the existence of a separate and independent Ukraine. So anything that guarantees that is off the table from the Russian side. They want to keep the war going. So it's hard to know what sort of what he could give to Trump, which would at least look credible from Trump's side. Trump has to go back to his American audience and justify this and sort of say, well, we've achieved something. Even there are limits. He can't continue going to these summits endlessly and coming away saying, well, we agreed to keep talking. So there's got to be something. Maybe that it could be something like they could put together a partial ceasefire, maybe at sea or in the air or on civilian infrastructure, something like that. And even that, we've heard talks about that in the past as well. And even that can easily be derailed on technicalities, which is another favorite strategy of the Russians. But that might be enough of a fop to say, look, we've achieved something. So I think it's going to be along those lines. I really don't see any room for a breakthrough until the pressure's increased on Putin. But he will have to give Trump something if he wants to avoid Trump, completely losing patience.
I'd like to move on to the meeting between Trump and Zelensky in a moment, but I just want to quickly ask you if you read any significance into the location of Trump and Putin's meeting. Budapest obviously being previously a place in which Ukraine's sovereignty was enshrined, supposedly in 1994. Is that of relevance, or is it just Putin doesn't really have many places he could meet Trump?
Oh, it's hugely relevant. It's hugely significant. It's absolutely no accident that Putin proposed Budapest. I mean, there is a lot of other alternatives. They could have done it in the Gulf. They could have done it in Turkey. They could have done it in Switzerland. There are all sorts of different options. But Budapest serves a number of purposes for Putin. So I think primarily this summit's all about stalling, buying time, stalling. That's the principal goal, but holding it in Budapest also ticks a lot of boxes for the Russians. It kind of humiliates the Europeans. It shows them their place because they're going to have to not only accept that this summit's taking place in Europe while Putin is on the International Criminal Court's wanted list. They're going to also have to allow him to pass through their airspace as well. So a number of countries, it may be Romania, it might be the Poles and the Baltic states, are going to have to say, yeah, fine, we allow that, and the Americans will basically say, okay, this, you need to give guarantees that they can fly through your airspace, and that's kind of embarrassing for the Europeans, and I think Putin will revel in that, the idea that they're being shown that essentially here, they're not significant players. It's all about America and Russia. Europe will do as it's told, sort of thing. So that ticks a box. Again, I mentioned the International Criminal Court. That's embarrassing for them. The Hungary is a member. The other European countries whose airspace will be needed are also members. They should arrest him. They won't arrest him. He's wanted on for war crimes, for the mass abduction of children, which is a pretty much textbook case of genocide. One of the 5 articles of genocide in the UN's own genocide convention. There's pretty serious stuff, and yet he's going to be able to waltz into Europe and presumably get the red carpet treatment. And I think the other thing it does is gives a little boost to Viktor Orban, who's Putin's great friend, his only really serious ally in the European Union, who's up for re-election next spring, and is not, his chances don't look great at the moment. But having Putin and Trump there gives him a significant boost. He's going to milk this for all it's worth. He's going to portray himself as a great statesman and try and get something out of that. So there's a lot of different factors here that play to Russian interest and Putin's advantage. So it's absolutely no accident they chose Budapest. I think it's very specific and a very sort of cunning choice by Putin.
And actually, just another quick question: Do you before we move on to the meeting today, do you think this is Putin's last chance, essentially, with Trump?
I wouldn't say last chance. No, I mean, I think again, the proverbial Trump's proverbial patience must be wearing thin. That's surely the case. But no, I mean, I think there's going to be more, unfortunately, of this. He's going to stretch it out as much as he can. I mean, fundamentally, I think Trump is has very little appetite for a confrontation with Russia. So he'll allow this to be strung out. I don't think it's particularly, I mean, he could easily say no. He could have said no more summits. This is ridiculous, but he hasn't. He said, yeah, great, let's do it again. So you would assume that while I think broadly speaking, Trump recognizes that Putin doesn't want peace. He's maybe not a lot of pressure, but he knows that the American public and the American establishment back Ukraine and are very, very concerned of what a Russian victory in Ukraine might mean. So, there's a lot of factors that are pushing him away from Putin and towards, supporting Ukraine, standing with Ukraine. But fundamentally, he doesn't want to have he likes Putin, he likes Russia, he doesn't want to have a fight with them. So he'll allow himself to be strung along, as it were, I think.
And so then moving on to Trump and Zelensky's meeting today, I'll try and refrain from asking you to make any solid predictions of what might be happening. But do you think Trump now puts more stock in Zelensky's narrative and what's happening from his side of things, or from what Putin is telling him?
Well, I think he's had a chance. I think the relationship between the personal relationship between Trump and Zelensky has improved significantly. I think they got off on the wrong foot, to put it mildly, going back to Trump's first term in the White House. I think he was inclined to sort of dismiss Zelensky as a bit of a bit part, not a serious player. But I think he's learned to respect him more. And they've got to know each other better. They've had 4 or 5 meetings now in this year so far. They seem to have more. They seem to have struck up more of a rapport on a personal level. And Trump was hearing a lot of Russian narratives for a long time, from different sources, from people within his own circle. And he wasn't hearing Ukrainian narratives. He wasn't hearing the Ukrainian side. He was very skeptical of it. I think he associated with his political enemies, with the Biden administration, with Biden, and more broadly, just his opponents. So he was inclined to go with the Russian narrative, but I think it's worn a bit thin now. He started to see problems. I mean, there were very interesting reports today that apparently in Alaska, Putin launched into one of his notorious historical diatribes. He basically lectured Trump for half an hour or so about early medieval Kiev and Rus history and these different Yaroslav the Wise and these ancient princes. And this is people laugh at Putin for doing this, but he's serious about this. I mean, Putin really believes in this. He has a sort of mystical belief in Russia's right to own Ukraine. And I think when Trump hears something like that, Trump's such a pragmatic, sort of practical business guy, a deal maker. When he hears someone who's like ranting like that, essentially in his face, it seems like, he said, I think he must have been in disbelief. I think he must have been, in shock by it. Apparently he was. Apparently he raised his voice, and it really, it sort of ruined the mood, ruined the vibe, as it were. And, I think, but that's the reality. When Trump sees this sort of thing, and I think he must sort of start to think, oh, he's serious. Putin really believes this stuff. He's completely detached from reality. So that certainly helps Ukraine's cause, because Ukraine's coming in with quite, I would assume, quite practical comments, saying this is what we need, this is the situation, this is what we're trying to achieve. And Putin's ranting on about history. This is not going to help the Russian position, and I'm sure that influences Trump.
What do you think Zelensky could do in the meeting today to secure Tomahawks for Ukraine? Is there anything that he could do?
I'm not sure in the short term if there's much he can do. I mean, I think these meetings are really important, not necessarily for, obviously, of course, it's good to get concrete wins and concrete results, but I think really it's all about building that personal relationship between Trump and Zelensky, to be sort of consolidating that. That's such an important factor with someone like Trump, who he manages things on. He's outside of party politics essentially. He's it's all about getting on well with him. So of course, as every flattering Trump has become like the geopolitical game of the year. Everyone does it. Everyone's trying to do it. And Zelensky has a lot of charm and charisma. He can do that very well. He can flatter him well. He can do it in intelligent ways. That's the reality that I'm sure he will do that today. But, it's all about, I think, presenting Ukraine's case, building that personal relationship between Trump and Zelensky, sort of strengthening their rapport. And also, I would imagine putting out specific plans of what Ukraine is trying to achieve. Again, to get around this idea that this is just an endless war and Ukraine is just going to, fighting on with no real goals in mind. If they could say, look, this is what we're trying to achieve. We want to. Zelensky's been quite clear in recent weeks. He said, our goal is to solidify the front line. Stop Russian advances, solidify the front line, increase attacks inside Russia. Disable or dismantle or destroy as much as possible of Putin's war machine inside Russia, protect Ukraine's cities, and then we can get to a position where perhaps it will become realistic to achieve some sort of a negotiation, genuine negotiations with Russia. So he's got a vision, and it's a plausible vision. Not everyone will agree that it's entirely realistic, but it's plausible. And if he can put that out to Trump and explain what America's role in this will be, intelligence provision, certain categories of weapons, certainly the Patriots for air defense, hopefully the Tomahawks and maybe other weapons as well, Atacams maybe as well, for those long-range strikes, more weapons also for the F-16s. It can be quite specific and say, look, this is what we need, this is what we're trying to achieve, and we think if we get this, there's a realistic chance that we can force Putin to the table, because that's the only way it's going to happen, I think. It's only going to come through a change in the military situation where Putin starts to realize things aren't going well. I mean, they're not going well now for Russia, but rather than not just going well, they need to be going badly for the Russians. And Putin needs to have a sense that things are going to get worse for him. And for that to happen, Ukraine really needs the Americans fully on board.
And so would it be wrong of me to say that your maybe prediction for the outcome of this meeting would be just a warming of relations between America and Ukraine? And if that is the case, do you see any pathway that Trump might still walk away from Ukraine, as he's threatened to do in the past?
I think that's the most likely outcome. Let's see. I mean, there could be some categories. They could even give a small number of Tomahawks. I mean, let's see. I mean, if they were to give, if Trump were to say, okay, I'll give you, I don't know, let's say 50 Tomahawks, that's not going to have a huge impact on the war, but it would be a significant step. So it could be something like that. But I think, fundamentally, the most important thing is this building a relationship. There's always a danger that Trump could walk away. There's always a danger. I mean, we haven't got away from that, but I think it's unlikely because American interests would be significantly damaged, not only in terms of Europe, the security for Europe, but even more broadly on a global scale. I mean, the damage to the reputational damage that America would suffer from abandoning Ukraine would be pretty severe. The entire sort of geopolitical landscape would shift. And all of a sudden, China would be in the ascendancy, Russia would clearly be in the ascendancy, and so on. America would be deeply, deeply discredited. And then you have those practical implications for Europe as well. The European security Europe would be plunged into a major security crisis. That would have implications for transatlantic security and the transatlantic relationship on an economic level as well, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, there's so many reasons why it would be a really bad idea for Trump to walk away. That doesn't mean he won't do it. I mean, there's always the potential that he might, but I think logic dictates that it looks unlikely. And to be honest, the position he's in at the moment, where essentially America, while providing some support, America's basically selling weapons now. That's a pretty good position to be in. He's basically managed to maneuver America to pretty much, to a significant degree where he said he would get them and where a lot of Americans wanted to be, because they support Ukraine. There's very little American support for Russia. There's a clear majority still now, more than 3.5 years into the war, who back Ukraine and think America should back Ukraine, but they don't want to pay for it. Well, Trump's delivered on that. He's now got a situation where America's providing weapons, Europe's paying for it, and they're arming Ukraine. So everyone gets something out of the relationship. Ukraine gets the weapons they need. Europe gets a bit of breathing space and protection from the Ukrainian military, essentially. And Trump gets to play a role in the process, supporting Ukraine, defending American interests, and earning money. So I don't think he's in that bad a position at the moment. So of course, there's always a chance he could walk away. He's Trump, but it looks to me like that's unlikely, and it's less likely today than it was, a few months ago.
Well, Peter Dickinson, thank you for talking to me today.
Thank you.